Hi, today I'll be going over this paper called Knowledge Neurons in Pre-trained Transformers. And this paper introduces the idea of knowledge neurons, which are neurons within a model that contribute to its recall of a fact. So first, the authors hypothesize that there are knowledge neurons within the feed-forward layers of the transformer. And they view the feed-forward layers as key value memories, which is visualized here. So the first linear layer of the network corresponds to the keys, and the second linear layer corresponds to the values. And for more information, I would read this paper here. But knowing this is relevant because the authors later propose a knowledge editing method that assumes the feed-forward layers as key value memories. Moving on, let's talk about how to identify these so-called knowledge neurons. So for example, given this input prompt, the capital of Ireland is blank. How do we identify the knowledge neurons that are responsible for expressing the fact that the capital of Ireland is Dublin? Well, they propose a knowledge attribution method that involves calculating the attribution score for the neurons in the feed-forward network. And this is the formula for calculating the attribution score for the ith neuron in the ith feed-forward network. I bar here is the original value of wi, and this function here represents the probability that the correct answer is predicted by the model, given the input prompt and given that our wi neuron is equal to the input of this function. So intuitively, you can imagine that this term represents the gradient of the model output with respect to the neuron that we're trying to find the attribution score of. So if this neuron has a greater influence on the model's expression of the correct fact, then the gradient term would be larger and the attribution score would be higher. To identify the knowledge neurons, we calculate the attribution scores and collect the neurons whose scores are greater than some threshold t. But if we're collecting the highest scoring neurons for one particular prompt, it's possible that some of these neurons are false positives. So, for example, they might be activated by the syntactic or lexical characteristics of that specific prompt, but not by the relational fact that's underlying the prompt. So to refine the set of neurons, they use a diverse range of prompts that correspond to the same fact, which in our previous example is the fact that the capital of Ireland is Dublin. And for each of these prompts, they calculate a set of knowledge neurons and only keep the neurons that have a high attribution score across different prompts. So the fourth step is only retain the knowledge neurons shared by more than some p percentage of prompts. So this is the knowledge attribution method that is proposed, and they move on to compare their attribution method to a baseline method. And this is the baseline attribution score, which is just the activations of a particular neuron. So to compare the two attribution methods, the first thing that they did was suppress the activations of the knowledge neurons and look at how this affected the model's knowledge expression. As you can see, doing so decreased the probability of the model making a correct prediction by 29% on average, whereas for the baseline method, this was only 1.5%. And along similar lines, they also tried amplifying the activations and found that this increased the probability of making the correct prediction by 31%, whereas for the baseline, this was only 1.3%. So as we can see, the activations of knowledge neurons is positively correlated with the model's recall of a particular fact. Then the paper moves on to explore which prompts will activate the knowledge neurons. They split prompts up into three groups. Group 1 contains prompts that actually express the facts from which the knowledge neurons were identified. So they are knowledge assessing prompts, whereas group 2 and 3 are control groups and they are not knowledge assessing prompts. And these values here are the average activation of knowledge neurons. And comparing across the prompt types, we can see that the activations for the baseline knowledge neurons are pretty much the same across all the prompt types, whereas the proposed method is able to identify knowledge neurons that are activated by knowledge assessing prompts, but not so much by the control group prompts. So after verifying that their proposed method is successfully able to identify the knowledge expressing neurons, they provide some case studies of how to make knowledge edits by making use of these neurons. So in the first case, they propose a method for updating a single fact. So suppose we have a fact, and we want to update the tail entity from T to T prime. Step 1 of the proposed procedure is to identify the knowledge neurons for the original fact. Step 2 is to keep the knowledge neurons shared by less than 10% of intra-relation facts. Intra-relation facts are fact pairs that share the relation R. And the purpose of doing this step is to reduce the influence that our edit has on other head-tail pairs with the same relation. So we want to affect those facts as little as possible, so we only retain knowledge neurons that are shared by less than 10% of the interrelation facts. So after filtering for the knowledge neurons, we make an edit to each knowledge neuron by subtracting the previous tail entity's word embedding, which here is little t, and adding the new tail entity's embedding to the value slot of the neuron that we're editing. And so recall that the value slot of a neuron is in the second layer of the feed-forward network. And we would do this edit for each of the knowledge neurons that we identified. Lambda 1 and lambda 2 here are constants, and in the paper, they used 1 and 8 respectively. So you can see here are the results. They are non-trivial. So after the update, T prime becomes the top prediction for 34.4% of updates. And in this paper, they edited the top 4 knowledge neurons, but it would be possible to improve the success rate by including more knowledge neurons in the update process. So the second case is the erasure of a relation. So let's say we have a model that stores knowledge about sensitive relation, for example, work location, and we want to erase all the facts that correspond to this relation. Then their proposed method of erasing all facts corresponding to some relation R is to identify the top 20 knowledge neurons for that relation and set the value slots of those knowledge neurons to 0. This table here shows a notable increase in the perplexity of the removed knowledge, which basically means that the update has impaired the model's ability to express the relation that has been erased. And in comparison, the update has a relatively small impact on the expression of facts for other relations. So, in summary, this paper introduces the idea of knowledge neurons, proposes a method to identify these so-called knowledge neurons, provides analysis to show that the activation of such neurons is positively correlated with knowledge expression, and finally attempts to leverage these knowledge neurons to make factual edits.